The first design Gen Alpha ever saw was a surveillance feed. Not a mobile, not a picture book, a Nanit baby monitor, mounted overhead like a security camera, streaming their crib to a dashboard of sleep metrics, breathing patterns, and movement graphs. Before they could hold a crayon, their bodies were being rendered as data. And now, 15 years later, that same generation is putting the data on their walls. They call it surveillance design. Monospaced type, strict grids, timestamp overlays, CCTV framing, high-contrast palettes stripped to black, white, and a single accent color. The whole visual language of monitoring systems, repackaged as the most sought-after aesthetic in youth culture. The generation that grew up inside the dashboard decided the dashboard looked good, which raises a question nobody in the design industry wants to sit with for too long. When the tools of control become objects of desire, who exactly is in charge? Every generation absorbs the architecture of its childhood and eventually reproduces it as style. Boomers who grew up in mid-century suburban homes turned clean lines and open floor plans into aspirational living decades later. Millennials raised inside the early internet's clunky interfaces now fetishize Y2K design, all chrome bubbles and pixelated gradients. The pattern is consistent. You don't choose what feels like home, home chooses you, and then you spend your 20s calling it an aesthetic. Gen Alpha's home was a panopticon. Apple Screen Time launched in 2018 when the oldest alphas were 8. Google Family Link, Life 360, Go Guardian on every school Chromebook, Ring doorbells recording every arrival and departure. By the time these kids could read, they were reading data about themselves. Weekly screen time reports, app usage bar charts, location pings confirming they were where they said they'd be. The average American now spends over 7 hours a day looking at screens, but for Gen Alpha, those screens were also looking back. The visual grammar of surveillance design, the grids, the utilitarian typography, the dashboard layouts, isn't borrowed from some obscure design subculture. It's borrowed from Tuesday, the interface that told them dinner was in 10 minutes, and also that they'd spent 4 hours and 17 minutes on YouTube. So when a teenager pins a poster to their wall that uses OCR A-type, a strict 12-column grid, and a timestamp in the corner, they're not referencing Swiss modernism. They're referencing their screen time notification. The formal vocabulary is identical. The emotional register has shifted entirely. The brands that understood this first were the ones already operating like intelligence agencies. Cortez, the London streetwear label, built its entire identity on restricted access, location-based scavenger hunts, and a visual language that reads like a classified briefing. Drop announcements use utilitarian graphics, grid-heavy layouts, militant typography. To buy the product, you had to be tracked. You had to follow, engage, prove you were watching. The surveillance was the experience. Gen Alpha and late Gen Z treated each drop like a covert operation they were thrilled to be surveilled within. Balenciaga pushed the same frequency into high fashion. Demna's runways in 2022, the 360-degree LED snowstorm, the mud pit, framed audiences as specimens under harsh institutional lighting. Campaign imagery used security camera angles, mugshot-style portraits, typography stripped to system defaults. He left for Gucci in 2025, but the visual codes outlasted him, still circulating, still getting remixed on TikTok, still printed on bootleg tees, absorbed into a generation's visual diet years after the runway that produced them. The pipeline from luxury runway to Gen Alpha mood board can now take as little as 72 hours. And then there's the phenomenon that makes the whole thing unmistakable: NPC streaming. Creators on TikTok Live performing as non-player characters, repeating scripted phrases when tipped, staring into webcams with the flat affect of someone being monitored. Because they are being monitored. The visual setup is indistinguishable from a surveillance feed. Fixed camera, centered subject, no production value by design. Gen Alpha didn't just watch these streams. They consumed them voraciously, turning the act of being observed into the content itself. The subject performs being watched. The audience watches someone performing being watched. The camera is the point. Andy Warhol understood this in 1966 when he filmed Edie Sedgwick watching a recording of herself in outer and inner space, collapsing the boundary between subject and viewer. 60 years later, a 13-year-old on a live stream is doing the same thing, except now it's monetized per interaction, and the audience numbers in the millions. Warhol needed a gallery. Gen Alpha needs Wi-Fi. What the design industry keeps calling a trend is actually a reveal. Surveillance design exposes something the branding world has been circling for years without naming. Gen Alpha doesn't treat transparency as a value. They treat it as a precondition. Research consistently shows this generation expects visible supply chains, real inclusion metrics, and verifiable claims. Not because they're idealistic, but because they grew up inside systems that made everything visible by default. When your childhood is quantified, you learn to read the data, and you learn to distrust anyone who won't show theirs. The brands succeeding with this generation aren't the ones promising privacy. They're the ones promising legible surveillance. Show me the grid. Show me the data. Show me the dashboard. The aesthetic preference and the ethical expectation are the same impulse wearing different clothes, which means surveillance design isn't a style. It's a worldview, one where opacity is suspicious and exposure is the baseline. The generation that was never unwatched doesn't dream of being unseen. They dream of controlling what the camera captures. But control is where the argument fractures. The Guardian's critique of vulnerability culture applies here with uncomfortable precision. What began as a rejection of perfection became its own form of perfectionism, the flawless execution of being flawed. Surveillance design risks the same collapse. A teenager choosing the CCTV angle for their Instagram post isn't being surveilled. They're performing surveillance. They pick the lens, the crop, the timestamp font. The rawness is rehearsed. The exposure is curated. And the more carefully you construct the appearance of being watched, the further you drift from the condition of actually being watched, which is the condition you never chose and cannot style your way out of. The oldest Gen Alpha members are 14, 15. Their aesthetic preferences are still being shaped by algorithms, older siblings, and platforms built by people twice their age. Calling this their aesthetic might be generous. It might be more accurate to call it the aesthetic that found them. The visual residue of a childhood spent inside monitoring systems designed by adults, now reflecting back as taste. Reclamation and capitulation look identical when you're standing inside the frame. The generation that never knew a world without cameras didn't learn to fear the lens. They learned to love it. And the difference between agency and surrender is something you can only measure from outside the system. Nobody inside has ever had the angle. So here's what I want to know. The last app you checked your screen time on, the last doorbell camera you glanced at, the last location ping you sent without thinking. Did those feel like surveillance to you? Or did they just feel like your phone? Tell me where the monitoring ends and the aesthetic begins. I suspect you can't find the seam. I already know the answer, I just want to hear you say it. The next time you see a grid, a timestamp, a dashboard rendered in black and white with a single accent color, and you think it looks clean, you'll know exactly whose childhood you're admiring. This is the threads of culture.